good afternoon, everybody. Happy New Year, and I'm very glad to see such a good attendance of this meeting. Let me present to you the key messages and recommendations of the evaluation. The evaluation has 5 key messages. The first message is that overall, the MFF modality has partially achieved its objectives. The modality was created with 3 objectives: providing financing for large-scale development projects, improving efficiency of ADB operations, and enhancing the quality of development results of ADB finance projects. Of these 3 objectives, MFF operations were found to do well with the first objective, partially well with the second, and did not do well with the third. The second message, long-term engagement at the sector level and a secure financing flow for large-scale development projects over an extended time period remain the key advantages of the modality. On the other hand, efficiency gains in terms of savings in commitment fees and operations time were found to be not as important as they used to be. The third message, the delegation of authority combined with periodic monitoring and advanced reporting has not, in general, compromised the quality of MFF operations. The quality of MFF operations were found to be generally comparable with standalone projects. And most operational problems were common among all ADB investment operations. The fourth message, the potential for MFF operations to deliver transformational development results has not been fully realized. MFF operations have focused almost exclusively on delivering physical investment outputs, while policy reforms and institutional capacity development have been marginal. As a result, MFF operations have not been able to address fundamental development bottlenecks to deliver systematic and irreversible changes as expected. The fifth message, with adjustments to be made, the MFF can be a powerful instrument for ADB to serve clients, countries, and promote transformational development change in the region. This leads to my next slide on recommendation. The evaluation offers 4 recommendations. Generally, the evaluation recommended that ADB take actions to restore the benefits and operational attractiveness of the modality and ensure that future MFF operations deliver results. Specifically, here are the 4 recommendations. First, ADB should review the use of MFF modality and update the policy to ensure it is aligned with the Strategy 2030 to deliver integrated solution and realize its transformational development potential. Under this recommendation, ADB should explore combinations of MFF with different modalities, including non-sovereign financing options, to address issues cross sectors and cross thematic areas in a comprehensive and integrated way. Also, ADB should explore the use of TA funding to finance activities beyond physical investment outputs to capitalize on the longer-term engagement of the modality for greater result. The second recommendation, ADB should introduce measures to ensure that the MFF implementation schedule is realistic and all operations intended to be financed under the MFF program are completed. This recommendation addresses specifically the issues related to the current 10-year time constraint of the modality. The evaluation offers 4 options, ranging from measures to speed up the progress of the MFF, to restricting the number of MFF tranches, and extending the time limit, and leaving the MFF modality with no defined maximum availability period as other modalities. The third recommendation, ADB should enhance the learning from prior tranches by ensuring it is captured and utilized to improve the design and implementation of subsequent tranches. Under this recommendation, the evaluation called for a more open learning culture in ADB. Learning from earlier tranches should be a prerequisite for approval of subsequent tranches. Changes in the design and implementation of subsequent tranches based on the learning from earlier tranches should be seen as a positive feature of the MFF operations. Fourth recommendation, and the last one, adjust the requirement for MFF operations to reduce the transaction costs and restore the operational attractiveness of the modality. In particular, the evaluation recommended that ADB 1 further streamline the MFF documentation, revisit the requirements that chance design be specified upfront, and use more flexible and efficient models for chance PCRs. Thank you very much.
I'm very happy to see so many of our colleagues attending this first event of the year. Well, no surprise, as our presenters have said before, almost 53 billion have been issued through this modality. It means that many of us have been involved in processing MFF, and I'm sure that you're all interested in asking the panel questions as well. And let me first start with Ramesh, who has been in many departments and has seen many of these operations, has an extensive experience dealing with MFF and comparatively with other operations as well. And perhaps you can tell us from your operational point of view, what do you see as the advantages and disadvantages of MFF, in your views succinctly of the perspective that have been brought by the evaluation, especially on the achievement of objectives. As we said, objectives have been partially achieved. What are your views on these two issues?
Thanks very much, Marvin. Before I respond to those 2 points, I want to thank IED. This is a very good report. Very good report for various reasons. I think there have been extensive consultations. The diagnostics that were done for the study were really good. The previous evaluation that was done a few years ago that had taken the first pass look at MFFs. So this one builds on that. There have been obviously a lot of developments since then, so greatly appreciate. And also for me, this is the second learning event of IED that I'm attending, so thanks for this opportunity. I think as been mentioned, as well as noted in the one-pager, those of you who don't have time to look at the entire report, that one-pager is quite nice. It outlines what the advantages are. I'll just mention, I used to be in CWRD used to be in Southeast Asia when the modality was introduced, and then subsequently in CWRD, and now back in Southeast Asia. The advantages are, I think generically looking across countries, you've got long-term commitment, long-term engagement. Along with it comes greater readiness, greater scope for getting projects ready. I was just chatting with E.D. Pandey that in a typical project, it takes us about 7 years from start to finish to implement. Many of us who are involved on the implementation monitoring processes, there are some PPFD colleagues here. We always keep debating, should we not be, point zero is not the time when the project begins right after approval. It takes about 2 years for serious implementation to begin. Should we not be shifting the S-curve 2 years to the right? MFF addresses precisely that problem because it gives you resources. Typically, the first tranche of an MFF helps prepare the entire sequence of investments. It helps with planning. And as a result of that, it reduces the transaction costs to the borrowers as well as to the ADB. Predictability point that I already mentioned. The roadmap that MFF modality has got is a fantastic tool if used properly. In the sense that we engage with serious policy dialogue from the beginning during, if you have a transactional TA, the time we utilize in not just putting together the technical aspects, but the policy changes, institutional changes that we want to achieve. For example, I have Marcus Rosner, who worked on the Malolos-Clark time-sliced MFF for Philippines. Institutional capacity in implementing agencies is very critical. MFF modality, by having the long-term commitment, really helps address by allowing ADB to stay engaged over a, say, 7 to 10-year period or so. On the second point on why have objectives not been met, clearly, it's a complex issue. The report goes into a number of case studies. I'll just speak from experience. Vietnam is a country where in Southeast Asia, Vietnam is the largest consumer of MFFs. In the early days, we did water and urban transport, and subsequently in power transmission. Across these three sectors, the subsectors, power transmission worked actually quite well. Because the objectives were quite well defined, investment requirements are quite clear. Now, that doesn't differ in water supply and transport, but in those two sectors, the overall project landscape or the investment landscape was much more complex. You had more serious land acquisition issues to be sorted out, the typical problems that we face in many projects. So in the case of Vietnam, it was clearly, probably lack of upfront readiness before we worked on having the first design of the three facilities. Water, by the way, these MFFs are still underway. So we are taking a lot of course corrective actions, which is another positive feature in MFFs because it allows for flexibility to learn. I think that was one of the points that Ben had made as well. In the case of water, quite complex investments across the entire country. So there is a lot of learning that you do, and you, as part of that learning, you do need to take corrective actions. And that was probably, water is more complex because it's localized, decentralized subject. I'll just make, last point I wanted to make also to reflect on your point on why objectives may not be met. It's also partly related to how much efforts that we put into readiness in early stage consultations and so on. The MFF modality places, I was also again chatting with ED very briefly. There is delegation from the board to management and then to staff. Now, with greater delegation, obviously, comes much more humongous responsibility in terms of what we undertake to in terms of commitment to the board. In the case of Indonesia, there has been only one MFF done so far. That got completed in 2007-8 or so. By the way, that was only the beginning of the first tranche we had begun to implement. And we learned very quickly that the safeguard issues were much more challenging than we had thought. So by committing to a very large facility, on a relative basis, a lesson that was learned as we were implementing the first tranche was that perhaps a standalone modality on a pilot basis might have been a better option than going for an MFF. So clearly, in that case, the objectives might have been met had we done a smaller pilot project before going into a large-scale project. So reasons differ across countries, across sectors, Marvin. Let me stop there. I can come back to some of the points later.
I find it interesting that you mentioned reduction of transaction costs and serious policy engagement. In your own personal experience have been important factors in I suppose you're talking about MFF that worked because one of the observations of and findings of the evaluation is that policy engagement was not sufficient and the reductions of transaction costs did not materialize. But we'll hear more perhaps also from the participant to see what is your experience, and I'm sure we're going to hear more from Sunwa, and also precisely is a question that I have for Jiro. What happened there? But we'll come back to Jiro in a moment. But Sunwa, the SARD is definitely one of the main users of MFF. Half of the MFF that have been approved have been in SARD, and half of the portfolio of SARD is MFF at the same time. So there's a strong preference for the use of MFF. What explains this preference for the use of MFF in SARD?
Okay. I think one key reason for the extensive use of MFF in SARD is largely due to the pure scale and the volume of the projects in countries, especially such as in India and Bangladesh. And in these two countries, elsewhere in our other client countries, transport energy sector projects are the priority sectors. And these are really large scale projects. In India, we are not doing rural road, but a lot of larger projects with significant intended development outcomes. And this required mid to longer term financing and continuous support. So I think it is unavoidable for these countries for any effective development financing. The MFF is a very important and the preferred modality. And also in such sectors as energy sectors, there are a lot of emphasis on renewable energy and the conversion into efficient energy resources, which will also lead into phased implementation of distribution, transmission, and also followed by institutional development for operation and management. And this will fit very much well with the sector development objectives in the energy sector. And in cases of India, I think one of the important reasons, which also comes from my experience, is that the lending also goes to the state governments as well as some central ministries. And the state governments will continuously have to negotiate with the central government for financing if they have to go standalone projects. And with the priority sectors, transport, also urban development and energies, the state government would very much like to have a longer-term predictable financing along with the continuity of ADB engagement. And in India, the two of the things which I learned always, the project readiness is a priority emphasis by the government, and that's also to avoid some of the commitment charges. And the second thing is not just the financing, but financing plus. And the key question the government will ask from ADB is, what are you bringing with your financing? what are the value addition. And that requires longer-term policy dialogues, reform implementation, and institutional capacity building. And the MFF are offering those value addition features through a longer-term engagement. And I believe that's why many of our client countries, especially in SARD with the larger projects, would prefer it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that perspective. Let's go back to what we mentioned at the beginning about one of the observations also and findings of the evaluation, that the instrument was nice at the beginning, huge peak of approval, but then it became complex and cumbersome, and a lot of things were added to it, maybe also related to delegation of authority. That will come to Idi Pandey to hear his perspective on that in a moment. But first, Jiro, what happened along the way? Why did it become so complex, convoluted, and difficult to process?
Thank you very much. First of all, I also want to echo Ramesh that thank you very much for the collaboration that took place for the preparation of this report. We went back and forth, quite a detailed email strain that regarding some of the findings of the reports. Thank you also for IED for inviting us to this panel, and then let me join this very distinguished panelists here. The question about this cumbersomeness, and then you didn't quite use that word in the report, but some process
that's what we meant.
Took place. Anyway, I wish you had used that word, but anyway, yes, I think it's true, and I think it's a fair findings, right? I mean, that over time, processing has been evolving. And it was probably the tendency is more adding more rather than cutting out, dropping. Of course, I mean, this is a new instrument for us that with some of the features included in there, the long-term commitment, tranche approval, delegation of approval. There could be different sort of risks that might be involved in that. And we took a cautious approach, I would imagine, and we were adding some, and then also with the requests also, or the suggestions from the board members or from the regional department colleagues, we have been adding some steps. And then it's important, but also that we found it important that this report did not necessarily mention that whatever the steps that we added were inappropriate or it was not needed. So in a way, I think sort of overall institutional checks and balances in trying to self-regulate even within the sort of the framework that were allowed in the policy so that we make sure that we do our due diligence in bringing processing and then also implementing, supervising those MFF investment. Now, I think, yeah, and I think that's pretty much. I thought we were being very cautious, and then also it is a sort of the instrument that no other MDBs had before, so we were also kind of becoming a frontier in this one. And then I understand the World Bank had also adopted the recently a very similar type of instrument, building on our the experience in the past 10, 12, 15 years. So I think that's that's true. And we also say that the instrument has played an important role, although we say that some additions to the processing have affected the effectiveness and the efficiency of the instrument and the incentive for all of you to continue processing MFF. Some of you prefer to do other type of operation except on SARD, right? But we'll come back to that with a perspective going forward. Let's bring now the perspective from a board member. And Idi Pandey, you heard about
what our colleagues have said. What are your views from the board perspective of the advantages, disadvantages, and about this important point that we make in the report about delegation of authority? So we say that delegation of authority, 278 tranches that were approved on the delegated basis, 38 billion that were approved on delegated basis. And we say that the quality of these projects was not different from the quality of other standalone projects that are approved by the board. And so there's some lessons to be learned from that experience. Perhaps from your perspective of the board, what do you think? What are your reflections?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Marvin. Real pleasure to be here. Strong panel. I will approach this from the perspective of a board member without a substantive and significant operational expertise, but who's charged with delivering governance, challenge function, and injecting a strategic perspective on the basis of what my constituents value with this organization. I'll deal with delegation last. I guess what I would say with respect to advantages and disadvantages, I might structure it slightly differently and identify what kind of a facility would we seek to create if we were looking to recreate this facility now. We would want some form of facility which would allow us to make long-term commitments and build long-term relationships with our clients on the basis of well-delineated plans. We would want those to be implemented in a timely and efficient basis, so relatively speedy processing. We'd of course want diligent observation of safeguards and other requirements. We'd want that facility to support integrated solutions. We'd want that some docking with non-sovereign operations. We would want to capture learning at every stage, and we'd want to permit course corrections so that the baby and bathwater thing would not become a problem. And we'd want realistic timelines and clearly indicated expected results so we could evaluate things afterwards. Those are the kinds of things that colleagues have highlighted as we sort of worked your way down to my end of the panel. So I would think that some of this is self-evident. Certainly from the results of the evaluation, clearly MFF addresses some of these things and has not always effectively addressed all of them. I think that the potential is strong there. It would be, I'm looking forward to a very credible and detailed action plan and enhancement plan, whether or not that amounts to the overall review that the evaluation report calls for. From my perspective, I do not, although I am sympathetic to, I do not represent client interests. So my bias is always going to be slightly more to the oversight and governance side and a bit less on the efficiency side of the kind of trade-off that we as an organization must always experience. So there is a built-in bias from my side. My capitals are always interested in adding more processes. We're now very concerned about biodiversity, so that's going to be the kind of thing we're going to press for the safeguards to engage. That's not an efficiency argument, that's a comprehensive or governance oversight argument. I must admit that when I first arrived here and I learned about this modality, so you're telling me that on the basis of one shot we might approve $500 million, yes. Over 10 years, yes. And we're unlikely to ever hear of it ever again, yes. And I had to wonder what my predecessors had been smoking when they were convinced to do this. Now, as I've said before, and on a more serious note, the kind of trade-off between detailed, exacting oversight of every stage and efficiency and being able to actually address the needs of our clients, there are trade-offs. And board members have to make those kinds of decisions all the time. Personally, I think that It's clear that there have been some instances where oversight would be useful, greater mid-course corrections from a board perspective. But I would put this in the broader context of board management relations and suggest that there are ways of providing that kind of information to the board that don't necessarily need to disturb existing loan agreements and facility agreements. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We'll come back to hear your views of what needs to be specifically reformed. We've talked about what's going on. Let's talk about what we expect going forward. And I would invite you to come up with questions if you want to ask along me and take advantage of having this excellent panel. You're welcome to do so. And I see a colleague already asking for the floor.
I would like to ask IED and others that been involved in the MFF, what we have learned from the one that actually failed. Because I see from the ground there are so many kind of mixed information.
What have we learned from what? I'm sorry?
The failed MFF, the one that actually failed.
The failed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Second, given the nature of MFF, I would like to see this from ADB's reform perspective. I would like to see this being used as part of helping the country to build up their capacity to generate income and expand the cake, expand the economy. I haven't seen this. Maybe somebody can educate me on that. What is an example of MFF in that we use for helping the country to build up the income generating capacity?
Okay.
Third one, yes, I would like to ask about going forward. I would like to see that ADB much more consider about the changing the government in designing the MFF, because sometimes changing the administration is so drastic, like in the Pakistan context, for instance.
Yeah.
So that's cannot, if MFF crossing those kind of change in the administrative, the challenge is going to be very daunting.
Thank you very much. Very interesting questions, and some of them will have to be addressed by Walter, the director, and the team leader. Yes, please.
I'm Prashant Goyal from India. I have because I've seen the multi-tranche projects being implemented in India, I have some issues to raise. Now, you have raised the issue that there are certain concerns about such projects being implemented through MFF means. Now, the projects that we are targeting through this modality are essentially large-scale projects. Now, large-scale projects per se are problematic. They have their own complexities. So linking them just to, and drawing a conclusion, linking them to MFF modality, is that the correct approach? Because have we tried to compare with some similar large-scale project in the same country, not across countries, being implemented through a single tranche loan?
Yeah.
That is an issue. And please don't compare across countries, because environment implementation efficiency in China will not compare with implementation efficiency in India.
Do you necessarily have to use MFF? That's the question for large-scale projects.
It may not be the necessary thing. Another observation which has been made, that commitment fee is not an important criteria.
Yeah, okay.
No, but what I have seen from the side of the project implementing authorities, they give very much importance to the commitment fee aspect.
Okay.
So that is another thing. And maybe during this process, because the power has been delegated to the management and staff, have they come up with undue regulations in terms of some excessive monitoring which does not otherwise take place? That is another issue that you may like to touch. And one issue which was mentioned, that the policy implementation which was supposed to come along with has not come. But was it given due emphasis in the first place when the project was approved? Was it a sort of deliverable which was emphasized on when we planned for the project.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Yeah, these are all points that are extensively discussed in the report: choice of instrument, policy, insufficient policy dialogue, in excessive additional requirements. The three things that you have touched upon. Let me bring in quickly, perhaps if you address the point of failed MFFs, right?
All right. Yeah, let me quickly respond to some of these questions. First one is the failed MFFs. Yeah, actually, unfortunately, there are many examples of not so successful MFFs. You're from Pakistan resident missions, right? So in Pakistan, we have synced water MFF. That was, I would say, disaster. So it's implemented only like a very small portions of what it wanted to do. And we have other, in Vietnam, actually, the metro MFF also an unfortunate evidence.
Yeah.
There are various issues, but I think one key issue is the 10-year time constraints. The MFF usually designed for large investment, long term, and then suddenly it has 10 years cut. And many of them, especially the metro in Vietnam, beautiful, and highway in Vietnam, beautiful, almost reach the end, but 10 years reached, then they have to stop. That's very unfortunate. But in the sink water case, that's too ambitious design with a lot of, institution reforms and so on that were not supported by the local government and so on. So those are the two, but I don't think that we should name it more. And in terms of capacity, I would say, yeah, the report went very in detail of the capacity and reform and so on. We have I don't remember exactly the number and so on, but we calculated this very small percentage of the investment and the effort went into the policy reform and the capacity. So very much like a 0.5, 1.1% or something like that allocated, and then implemented only like a 0.0 some percent. Very, very small.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you very much. Let me go back now to the panel now. You will have your own perspectives as well. But at the same time, Ramesh said traditionally it was one of the most important users of MFF, but now they have picked up, right? Again, they decline and they have picked up. What is happening? Why is this becoming attractive again in CERD? Some of these issues that have been pointed out here are being addressed, or what's going on there that should excite us?
Just a couple of, I'll come to that, Marvin, just a couple of reflections on what Prashant and Guntur raised. I think Prashant's question is the right framing question. We can take Sindh project, which, by the way, I knew very well when I was in CWRD, or any investment. We don't need to name particular projects, but I think that framing question is very important. If you had done the same investment through a standalone project modality, would we not have faced challenges? I think that's the right evaluation question. Now, for these cases that we are looking at, my own take is that having been closely involved in some, we would have faced the same challenges because the issues are not different. So the modality per se does not impose those negativities or negative externalities on the particular project. Do MFFs have bigger impact on income generating capacity? I think there are. I'm sure if you look at some of these the transport projects, for example, in Vietnam, one of the first transport projects was one of the first MFFs was in the transport sector. That was implemented actually quite well, clear impacts. It's part of the GMS economic corridor, and I'm sure there must be other examples. On just reflecting on this point about did the pendulum kind of swing too far towards control? Maybe, but I think it's not a bad thing because in a way we've learned from that process. When we started the MFFs as part of the Innovation and Efficiency Initiative in 2004, we had more than 35 years of experience in doing standalone projects. We had a lot of experience from policy-based lending. P4R, the World Bank's Program for Results, or RBL, we hadn't started at that time. MFF was totally new. So I think given that, and there is always a balance in terms of how much delegation, how much responsibility is there, what we commit to in terms of providing information to the board. Some of it might have come. I don't think there is any different monitoring. I think we put same amount of monitoring for standalone projects. For MFFs, probably because you have PMUs, the project management units, which become seasoned and experienced over time. In fact, one would argue that monitoring burden probably goes down, assuming that there is continuity in the project personnel. On your question on what's happening in the third domain, Marvin, it's actually quite simple. In the case of Vietnam, in 2011 to 2014, we had done, because the government had a very clear plan to increase its infrastructure spending as a share of GDP. They were about 3% when we started. They wanted to increase it to about 6%. So they had a very conscious decision to borrow from ADB as well as from the other multilateral and bilateral institutions. And MFF was a convenient modality for them because it gave the long-term commitment. Now, very, very valuable lessons learned in that. We could have done, certainly with hindsight, we could have designed some of those projects better. Now, had we done standalone projects, I think my gut feeling is that it would have been the same. Now, subsequently, what happened was Vietnam has had the debt ceiling related concerns because of macro economy is doing very well, but public debt to GDP is now 62% of 62% is the ratio, and they wanted to reduce ODA financing and to go for more private sector financing solutions. I think here I wanted to just very quickly plug in on what E.D. Pandey said. Policy impact and policy dialogue that we have, clearly, it varies across MFFs. Roadmap is very critical. Now, do we implement the roadmap continuously and consistently across the program period? Now, that could be debatable. Probably we don't do, I'll admit openly, probably we don't do a good job of continuing because loan covenants may be there, but it is not like a policy-based loan where money is linked to it. So it is reforms taking place, institutional change taking place along with investments. Maybe there is more focus on the contract awards and disbursements and probably not on the policy change. I think there, particularly the private sector dimensions, water, great example in terms of bringing in private sector. Malolos Clark, we are hoping that although it's large-scale public investment, there will be private sector coming in the form of operations and maintenance, and hopefully eventually there will be funded risk participation.
Thank you very much. Definitely the report says, as Ben just said, 0.5 dedicated to that and 0.001 implemented to policy. Right? There's definitely an issue with policy. But let me come now back to Sonwa. Is it true that things are fine? It's not excess monitoring, as our colleague said, or any other things that we are saying in the report that are affecting the instrument, or you that have processed so many of them? Do you think that there are important things that have to be done to increase the efficiency and the effectiveness of this instrument going forward?
First of all, let me echo the questions posed and also what Ramesh mentioned. Actually, some of the challenges and the complexities that we face either in the larger project or other projects, including the policy dialogues and sector reforms. I think those are inherent issues, sometimes not necessarily for MFF per se. Some of the challenges we will find commonly in both standalone and MFF projects. And perhaps let me speak more from the project officer working at the field, with some of the opportunities and challenges that MFF brings, but also we face challenges in processing and implementation. We talked about that, some of the drastic changes are taking place in MFF, but also sometimes depending on the projects. I happen to be involved in 2 out of the 3 MFFs in the education sector. And also there's 2 out of the 3 are in Bangladesh, which are also involved. So I can speak from the social sector specialist perspective that this MFF brings a very important value addition for longer term investment in education and skills development, which you may not see the development impact in 5 years. And if you look at a lot of our skills development or some of the education projects, unless you are involved at the sector level, sector investment programs over time, standalone projects of 5-6 years, TVET projects, you have to build the skills, you have to build the schools, you have to reform the curriculum, and you have to do training. At the end, you will say the DMF, you haven't achieved what you set out to do. Whereas in in MFF, you can really follow the phased implementation, and then as expected, you can also integrate the lessons from the previous tranches going forward in tranche 2, and then you can scale up, you can build the institutional capacity. And some of the challenges that we see is sometimes at year 1, you may not be able to really foresee what you are going to do in detailed components in year 7 in tranche 3. So sometimes depending on how details you are supposed to put in the tranche descriptions at the facility level, if you are required to put too much details, then you will have to come up with the drastic changes along the way. So you have to put some of the expected outcomes of the facilities, but also you have to have some sense of how it's going to be implemented over time across the tranches, and you will put some of those the broader scope of each tranche. But if you put it too much prescriptive components or tranche scope earlier, then sometimes you are bound to face challenges, both in processing or in implementation. And I think some of the flexibilities as you go along will be also an important aspect of MFF, especially that I can speak from the social sector perspective.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think shall we come back to you now, or?
No, just very briefly, I wanted to pick up on Guntur's third question, which is an important one on if there are changes in government. That is precisely what MFF modality, where it will be very helpful, because governments don't need to, although it is a long-term commitment, but each tranche-based decisions can be taken by the government. If any changes, course corrections that are needed, we can do. But if there are major changes, we will have to go through. We have the business process for that. We need to go to the board for approval. So that flexibility is very much there in MFF.
Thank you very much. Let me go now to Ide Pandey and leave the last word to Jiro, because they are the one who have to change things if something is going to be changed. So Ide Pandey, does MFF called to play a role within Strategy 2030, and do you think that some specific reform have to be implemented?
Well, I think from a board perspective, I'm broadly agnostic as to the instruments, and I would defer to the practitioners as to which instruments, the people who need to maintain and build relationships with clients and help design and deliver integrated and knowledge-rich solutions. I personally don't care about whether it's MFF or project-specific or RBL or PBL. That's not my particular concern. My concern is that we as an institution utilize all of the instruments within our toolbox in the most appropriate way, that we utilize the knowledge that we have, and we have instruments which allow us to learn and course correct as we go along. So many of those advantages appear to sit within the at least defined role of MFFs. However, ideal and implementation, there's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip, as has been said. So I guess what I'd say is that as long as we use the solutions that we have on hand or redesign them, which then leads to Jiro and his contribution, I think that the board, we talked about trade-offs between oversight and efficiency or speed, but I think broadly speaking, the board wants to feel that the trust that it has given to management is being utilized properly. So perhaps a trust and verify Ronald Reagan-esque approach is perhaps the best. I think that this was a very good exercise for this device, this facility, this modality, because I think it's captured a lot of the common interests around the room or the table. I don't believe there's anybody who benefits unduly from a modality like MFF. I think we all want successful delivery of effective and efficient solutions for our clients.
Thank you very much, Iri Pandey. During the DEC discussion, for some of you who were there were actually strong calls for reform of the instrument, and Jiro was there. Obviously, all these calls came to him, and in fact, a specific timetable was demanded, and so it's refreshing to hear this view from Iri Pandey. But I'm just conveying to you what happened during the DEC meeting.
Well, Jiro heard some different views from me earlier today. I'll put it that way.
Yes, right. But if anything, as I said, is going to be changed, Jiro should lead that change in policy, right? If there is going to be any change. And so the question to Jiro is, what are your plans? In hearing the report, what the report is saying, hearing the discussion at DEC and the views of some of board members, what's in your mind?
Well, what's in my mind? There are a lot of things in my mind, but
about MFF, only that part.
What is MFF? Okay.
It's just that part.
I mean, the starting point is that we agreed with all the recommendations, and we said that in a management response that we agree with that, and then we are coming up with sort of specific actions related to that to be recorded in the management action record mark. So that we are discussing with the IED right now. And then pretty much, I think there are very good suggestions being made in the report, and also in a sense that there are, some of them already came up about the 10-year period, and then also about NSO, non-sovereign operations, sovereign operations, there. And then I think each of them kind of probably merits some consideration, due diligence for us to do, whether it is feasible to do. I mean, if we come up with sort of all of a sudden policy paper saying that we're going to make the implementation period totally do away with it, there will be some implications as well. So we might not want to do that. So I think approach we are taking is that we're going to come up with, well, actually we have already started working on, is to constitute a focus group represented by different parts of ADB. And discuss each proposals or suggestions that are being included in this report. And then also we will come up with an action plan that would hopefully enhance this modality, which has a very high potential of making a difference. And as one of the tools that we have, and then so that we can use it whenever it is most appropriate. And then during the course of that action plan development, of course, there will be a lot of engagement with the stakeholders, and one of them, of course, is the board members. So we will be engaging and discussing with everybody about what we are planning to do or what we think could be something that we can do. We will also definitely going to come up with some kind of capacity development of a training program as and when we decide the enhanced sort of MFF facility. And then also, of course, some of the more written sort of guidance notes type of thing will also be updated. So that's generally the plan that we have right now. So the consultation period and the action plan, we hope we estimate probably Q1, Q2, maybe coming up in early Q3 or something to be able to report to you. But also, I mean, during the process, I think there will be some sort of information coming out from us and getting their views and getting their insights and advice.
Well, colleagues, thank you very much. The time has come to an end. I'm not going to summarize, but it is clear that in listening to the panelists, that if this instrument did not exist today, the feeling is that it would have to be created for a number of reasons that have been explained by the panelists, right? Long-term engagement, scale, predictability, etc. That's the feeling that I get from the panelists. In fact, as Jiro said, the World Bank just came up with this instrument, this modality, copying, and I know they told me exactly this word, right? Copying what ADB had done. But at the same time, the feeling of the panelists is that this has to be accompanied by policy dialogue, by capacity building, which did not happen in the past. And that has also been proposed by one of our colleagues. Clear identification and choice of instrument is important. It's not because the instrument is there, you're going to use it. There may be other modalities that are more efficient. And finally, our colleague left here, but he's right that we have to look at failed experiences. And we have introduced a new line of products. One we already did on success and failures. And so we are hearing this advice of our colleague of looking at experiences and lessons from failed projects. There's a lot to learn from them, and we will continue digging in that direction. Please join me in a big round of applause to our panelists. Thank you all very much for accompanying us this afternoon. Thank you.